The following story is a narrative reconstruction built from hypotheses, rumors, and unverified accounts that have never been officially confirmed. There are versions that suggest the first threat was never meant to be taken seriously. A message delivered without urgency, a demand phrased like a suggestion. According to fragmented tellings, it arrived quietly, carrying no names, no dates, only an implication that something carefully buried could be uncovered if ignored. Some believe the woman at the center of the story had never intended to destabilize anything beyond her own survival. Others claim she knew exactly how fragile certain lives become when reputation is the only shield left. What remains unclear is when leverage turned into danger. There are versions where the man who received the message recognized the risk immediately. Not fear, calculation. The kind that measures damage before emotion has time to surface. In these tellings, he didn't respond at first. Silence can be a test. Sometimes it's the most revealing answer. The family, according to several interpretations, noticed the change before they understood its cause. Conversations shortened, doors closed more often than usual. A tension entered the home that did not announce itself, but pressed gently against every routine. Some believe the woman began to realize she had crossed a threshold she could not retreat from, that what began as control had attracted attention she never anticipated. There are accounts suggesting she tried to slow things down, to renegotiate, to soften the implication without surrendering it. Others insist the escalation was inevitable. Once something unspoken becomes named, even indirectly, it demands a response, and responses, when delayed too long, tend to arrive distorted. There are versions where the threat was never answered with words at all. Instead, decisions were made quietly, within a circle that did not include her. Family conversations, according to these tellings, became strategic, protective, detached. What followed has never settled into a single explanation. Some say the scandal erupted first, pulling hidden tensions into the open. Others believe the silence broke only after something far more permanent had already occurred. In every version, however, the same pattern emerges. What appeared to be a transaction between two people exposed something far older and far closer to home. A secret that did not belong to the woman, a truth the family had agreed not to remember, and a consequence that could no longer be contained once the threat forced it into motion. There are stories that don't begin with violence but with agreement, an unspoken one. According to some versions, this story took shape long before the message was sent, long before leverage was named, and long before anyone outside the family sensed that something was wrong. It began with a shared decision to keep certain memories sealed away, protected not by locks, but by routine. Families are often built on repetition, meals, traditions, silences. In these tellings, the silence mattered most. It wasn't enforced, it was inherited, passed down subtly, reinforced by the understanding that revisiting certain moments would destabilize everything that came after. Some believe the woman who later made the threat had no awareness of what lay beneath the surface. She saw influence, vulnerability, and opportunity, but not history, not the kind of history that doesn't fade with time, only with denial. Others suggest she sensed something else entirely, that the leverage she held felt heavier than expected, as if it connected to more than reputation alone. Still, whatever she believed, she could not have known how tightly the family's present was bound to a past they refused to revisit. This story does not move quickly. It unfolds the way families unravel, gradually, through small fractures rather than sudden collapse, through glances that linger too long, through decisions that feel justified in isolation but devastating in sequence. As you listen, you may notice how easily loyalty can shift into complicity, and how protection can transform into something far darker when it becomes unconditional. If you're watching from somewhere tonight where families are gathering, or where the night feels especially quiet, you're welcome to leave a comment sharing where you're listening from. Stories like this often feel different depending on the distance from home. And if you choose to stay with this narrative, consider subscribing. Not because it promises resolution, but because it continues to explore the uneasy spaces where intimacy and harm quietly overlap. What follows is not a record, it is a reconstruction, one shaped by fragmented versions, withheld truths, and the long shadow cast. When a family decides that silence is safer than memory, there are versions that suggest the family learned to live in layers, not deception exactly, structure, public warmth on the surface, private restraint beneath it. According to some tellings, this arrangement wasn't imposed by fear, but by convenience. It was easier not to ask certain questions, easier to accept the shape of things as they appeared. The man at the center of the household was known, at least within these narratives, for his composure. He spoke carefully. He listened selectively. In family settings, he preferred moderation over confrontation. This trait was often interpreted as maturity. In retrospect, some believe it functioned as something else: containment. There are versions where the family's routines became unusually precise after the message arrived. Meals occurred on schedule. Conversations remained polite, even when they grew thin. Small changes appeared, but none dramatic enough to raise concern. To an outsider, the household would have looked disciplined, perhaps even admirable. Inside, however, something had shifted. Some accounts describe a heightened awareness among family members, the sense that each word carried weight, that missteps, verbal or otherwise, could reverberate beyond the moment. These impressions are always described indirectly as feelings rather than facts. No one remembers a meeting, no dramatic confrontation, no collective decision. And yet, according to several interpretations, a shared understanding formed that whatever was happening outside the home must be managed internally, quietly, decisively, without expanding the circle of knowledge. The woman who sent the message existed entirely outside these routines. In most versions, she is described as peripheral, defined not by who she was, but by what she represented. Risk, exposure, a variable that did not respect boundaries. Her presence, even from a distance, disrupted the family's carefully maintained equilibrium. Some believe this is why the response took time. Not because the threat was underestimated, but because it required recalibration. The family had to decide how much of their structure could bend without breaking. What could be absorbed? What could not? There are tellings where the man avoided discussion at first. He did not deny the message's existence. He did not explain it either. His silence, in these versions, is interpreted as strategic, a way to delay escalation while assessing options. Others suggest the silence served a different purpose, a test. Silence can reveal how much others already know, how far rumors have traveled, how fragile a secret truly is. The family's response, whatever it was, did not involve reaching outward. No new alliances were formed, no outside assistance sought. The narrative consistently emphasizes this inward turn. The decision, implicit or explicit, to handle the situation within the family unit. There are accounts where this inward focus becomes unsettling. The line between protection and isolation blurs. Concern for collective stability begins to outweigh concern for individual safety. In these tellings, the family's loyalty becomes self-referential, prioritizing continuity over accountability. The woman, meanwhile, continued to exist beyond their reach. Some versions describe her growing uneasy, the lack of response interpreted not as compliance, but as dismissal. Others suggest she believed the delay meant progress, that negotiations were underway, unseen. There are interpretations where she attempted to reassert control, a follow-up message, a subtle reminder, nothing overt, just enough to confirm the threat had not dissolved with time. These actions are always described tentatively, as possibilities rather than certainties. What is consistent across versions is the family's reaction, not outward alarm, not visible panic, but tightening. Schedules became stricter, communication more selective. Certain rooms felt less accessible than before. These details are often described as impressions rather than events, suggesting memory shaped by outcome rather than observation. There are tellings where one family member sensed something was wrong, not the cause, just the weight, a heaviness that entered conversations without invitation. According to these versions, questions were considered and then abandoned. Curiosity tempered by instinct. It's believed that at some point the family began discussing outcomes rather than causes. What happens if the threat becomes public? What damage would follow? Who would absorb it? These discussions, when they appear in retellings, are never quoted directly. They are inferred from later behavior, from decisions that seem coordinated without having been announced. Some believe this is where the moral shift occurred, the moment when preservation of reputation overtook concern for consequence, when silence became not just a shield, but a tool. There are versions where the woman attempted to disengage, to reduce demands, to step back from the edge she had approached. These accounts suggest she sensed the danger too late, that the threat had already activated forces she could no longer influence. Others insist she never retreated. That confidence, once displayed, could not be withdrawn without cost. In these tellings, her fate becomes entangled with the family's response, inseparable from their internal calculus. What remains unclear is when intention hardened into action. There is no agreed-upon moment, no decisive turning point, just a gradual narrowing of options until one path remained viable, if not justifiable. The family's silence deepened, and within that silence, according to every version that survives, something irreversible began to take shape. Not in anger, not in haste, but in the quiet certainty that exposure, once threatened, must be prevented at all costs. There are versions that suggest the decision was never spoken aloud, not because it lacked importance, but because speaking it would have transformed intention into admission. According to these tellings, the family operated within a shared understanding that words could be more dangerous than action. Silence offered deniability. Silence preserved shape. What followed, in most reconstructions, unfolded through routine, ordinary days, familiar movements, the appearance of stability carefully maintained. The family continued to exist in public as they always had, while privately adjusting in small, deliberate ways. Doors were closed more often, schedules aligned more tightly, conversations shortened to essentials. Some believe this discipline was mistaken for calm, others interpret it as preparation. There are versions where one member of the family began to take on a different role, not a leader, not an enforcer, but a coordinator, someone who noticed details others overlooked, someone who ensured that nothing happened by accident. This shift is never announced in the story. It is inferred from patterns, from who speaks and who listens, from who moves and who waits. The woman, according to several interpretations, sensed the change without understanding it. The absence of response grew heavier. What once felt like leverage began to feel like exposure. In these tellings, she questioned whether she had misjudged the situation, whether the power she believed she held had been an illusion all along. Some accounts suggest she attempted to regain control through reassurance, a message that softened tone, an implication that discretion was still possible, nothing threatening, nothing explicit. Just enough to suggest cooperation rather than confrontation. There are versions where this attempt arrived too late. By then, according to some reconstructions, the family had already shifted from reaction to resolution. The question was no longer how to respond, but how to ensure finality. This is where the story grows more restrained. No explicit planning, no detailed sequence. Instead, the narrative emphasizes atmosphere, a tightening sense of inevitability. The feeling that momentum had quietly changed direction and could no longer be reversed without consequence. Some believed the family justified their course as protection, not cruelty, not malice. Protection of legacy, protection of stability, protection of one another. In these tellings, harm becomes collateral, something regrettable but necessary within the logic they constructed. Others see the justification as self-deception, a way to disguise fear as duty, to frame violence as preservation rather than violation. These interpretations coexist without resolution. The woman's perspective in most versions fades as the family's focus intensifies. She becomes less a person and more a variable, something to be managed rather than understood. This shift is subtle but significant. It marks the point where empathy gives way to calculation. There are accounts where a meeting occurred, not formal, not documented, just a gathering where eyes met and assumptions were confirmed without articulation. In these tellings, no one argued. Disagreement, if it existed, remained internal. The absence of conflict is often noted as unsettling. It suggests alignment not born of persuasion, but of shared fear. Fear of exposure, fear of collapse, fear of losing control over a narrative they had spent years maintaining. Some versions describe a final moment of hesitation, a pause before action, a recognition of what could not be undone. This hesitation is brief and easily overlooked in the retellings, but its presence matters. It suggests awareness, even if conscience did not prevail. The act itself is never described, not in detail, not in sequence. Every version avoids it, circling instead around its consequences. This omission is deliberate. The story does not exist to reconstruct violence, but to examine what surrounds it. What is consistent is the aftermath. The family did not fracture. They did not unravel. They closed ranks. According to some tellings, this unity is what made the outcome possible. Each member absorbed a portion of responsibility without claiming ownership. Guilt, if present, was distributed evenly enough to remain manageable. The woman's absence was noted only indirectly. Schedules adjusted. Certain topics disappeared from conversation. Her name, if mentioned at all, was treated as an inconvenience rather than a loss. This erasure becomes one of the story's most unsettling elements. Some believe the true scandal was not what happened to her. It was how easily the family adapted afterward. The threat she posed vanished. The silence she disrupted was restored. Life resumed its familiar rhythm, altered only by a new layer of restraint. There are tellings where the family believed the matter resolved, that exposure had been neutralized, that risk had been contained, that whatever had been sacrificed would not be missed beyond the circle that already understood. But stories rarely remain contained. And according to every version that survives, the sense of finality did not last. Something had shifted, not externally, internally. A pressure introduced by the act itself, a quiet awareness that preservation had come at a cost that could not be fully hidden. The silence that followed was deeper than before. And within that silence, according to those who continue to reconstruct the story, the foundations of something far older began to fracture, preparing the ground for consequences that would not announce themselves immediately. There are versions that suggest the family believed the worst part was over, not because they felt absolved, but because the immediate threat had dissolved. The message no longer arrived. The implication no longer hovered. The outside pressure that had forced internal alignment seemed to recede, leaving behind a fragile sense of control. According to some tellings, this is when the family returned to appearances. Routines resumed with careful enthusiasm. Public interactions softened. The tension that had pressed against daily life eased just enough to allow breath. To those watching from a distance, if anyone was watching at all, Nothing appeared disrupted. But stories rarely end when silence returns. In several reconstructions, the family's unity began to show hairline fractures. Not arguments, not accusations, something quieter. A misalignment of attention, a hesitation before agreement. Small discrepancies in memory that surfaced unintentionally. Some believe this was inevitable. When responsibility is shared without being named, it does not disappear. It settles unevenly. Some carry more weight than others. Some feel it sooner, and some refuse to feel it at all. There are versions where one family member began to withdraw, not physically, emotionally. Participation continued, but presence diminished. Conversations were answered rather than engaged. Decisions acknowledged rather than shaped. In these tellings, withdrawal becomes a form of self-protection. Others describe the opposite response, a member who became overly attentive, overly accommodating, someone who attempted to reinforce unity by smoothing over discomfort before it could surface. In these versions, harmony becomes performative, maintained rather than lived. The absence at the center of the story remained unspoken. No one mentioned it directly. No one asked questions that would require clarification. The family's earlier discipline intensified, transforming silence from strategy into habit. It no longer required effort. It simply existed. Some believe this habitual silence is what allowed consequences to take root. Without acknowledgement, unresolved tension seeks expression elsewhere. It surfaces indirectly, through behavior, through mood, through the subtle erosion of trust. These shifts are difficult to trace because they appear unrelated to any single cause. There are accounts where external attention re-emerged unexpectedly, not through accusation, not through inquiry, through curiosity. A comment made in passing, a question framed too casually, a look that lingered longer than expected. In these tellings, the family sensed attention before it became explicit. The feeling returned, not panic, but recognition. The same tightening that followed the initial message began to resurface. Schedules adjusted again, conversations narrowed, the circle of comfort shrank. The family did not discuss the cause. They recognized the pattern. Some versions suggest this recognition triggered a different response. Where earlier they had acted to prevent exposure, now they acted to preserve cohesion. The goal shifted subtly. It was no longer about eliminating risk, but about maintaining alignment. There are tellings where disagreement finally surfaced, not about what had happened, but about how to live with it. One member questioned whether silence still served its purpose. Another insisted that reopening the past would invite disaster. These exchanges are always described indirectly, as impressions rather than dialogue. No one claimed innocence, no one claimed guilt. The conversation, such as it was, circled the edges of responsibility without entering it. Some believe this avoidance deepened the fracture. When accountability is deferred indefinitely, it does not fade. It migrates. It appears in dreams, in irritability, in the sense that something fundamental has been displaced. The family's internal balance grew increasingly delicate. Small disruptions carried disproportionate impact. A raised voice, a delayed response, a change in routine. Each was felt more intensely than before, as if the structure supporting normalcy had thinned. There are versions where one family member began to remember differently, not inventing details, but questioning them, revisiting assumptions, wondering whether the story they told themselves had been constructed for convenience rather than accuracy. These thoughts were never shared. They remained internal, untested. Others insist no such doubt emerged, that the family's agreement remained intact, that unity held, that the consequences were external rather than internal. These interpretations often reflect the teller's own tolerance for ambiguity. What remains consistent is the sense of instability, not collapse, not exposure. Instability, a condition where balance must be constantly maintained, where effort replaces ease, where silence becomes work. There are tellings where this effort begins to exhaust the family. Emotional resources thin, patience shortens. The energy required to sustain alignment becomes increasingly visible. In these versions, the cost of silence becomes harder to ignore. The absence at the center of the story, still unnamed, begins to exert pressure, not through memory, but through omission, through the recognition that something has been removed without resolution, that a gap exists where acknowledgement should be. Some believe this is when the story truly turns inward. The threat that once came from outside now originates within, not in accusation, but in awareness. The realization that preservation achieved through erasure carries its own consequences. There are versions where someone considers breaking the silence, not publicly, not dramatically, privately. A thought that surfaces and recedes, the idea of speaking, not to expose, but to relieve. These moments are fleeting, but significant. They suggest that silence, once chosen, is not always sustainable. The family, however, does not act on these impulses. They remain bound by the same logic that guided them before. That stability depends on containment. That acknowledgement risks unraveling more than it repairs. According to every reconstruction that persists, this decision to continue rather than confront marks the beginning of a slower unraveling, one without spectacle, one without accusation, a quiet erosion of trust, alignment, and certainty that unfolds not through action, but through the sustained effort of keeping something unspoken alive. There are versions that suggest the family underestimated how long silence can echo, not immediately, not dramatically, but over time, silence begins to accumulate meaning of its own. According to some reconstructions, the family's daily life continued to function, but no longer flowed. Each interaction required calibration. Each conversation carried an unspoken awareness of what could not be referenced. The effort was subtle but constant. Some believe this constant adjustment reshaped relationships, not through conflict, but through distance. Emotional proximity diminished, even as physical closeness remained. People shared space without sharing relief. They spoke without revealing. In these tellings, intimacy eroded quietly. There are versions where one family member began to externalize the strain, not by speaking about the past, but by reacting disproportionately to the present. Small inconveniences provoked outsized frustration. Minor disagreements lingered longer than expected. These reactions were never connected explicitly to the silence, but they did not arise in isolation. Others internalized it. Withdrawal became routine. Engagement became selective. Emotional responses flattened. In these accounts, detachment functioned as insulation, a way to prevent the unresolved from becoming overwhelming. The family noticed these changes without naming them. Acknowledgement would have required explanation. Explanation would have required memory. And memory, in this narrative, was the one thing they had collectively agreed to avoid. Some believe the family mistook endurance for resolution. Time passed. No exposure followed. No external consequences arrived. From a certain perspective, the strategy appeared successful. The threat had dissolved. The structure remained intact. But stories rarely respect appearances. According to several tellings, the absence that had been managed so carefully began to assert itself indirectly. It appeared in conversations that stalled, in decisions deferred without reason, in the persistent feeling that something essential had been displaced. There are accounts where the family attempted to reinforce unity. Shared meals became more frequent. Traditions were emphasized. The outward image of cohesion was strengthened, perhaps in response to its internal weakening. These efforts are described as well-intentioned but strained. Some believe this reinforcement only highlighted the imbalance. When unity requires effort, it ceases to be natural. it becomes performance, and performance, sustained over time, extracts its own cost. There are versions where the memory of the woman, still unnamed, resurfaced unexpectedly, not as guilt, not as grief, as interruption. A thought that intruded without invitation, a question that formed and dissolved before reaching speech. In these moments, the family's earlier agreement felt less stable. Others insist these intrusions never occurred, that the erasure was complete, that the absence remained abstract. These conflicting interpretations reflect the story's central tension. Whether silence eliminates memory or merely delays it, the external world in most reconstructions remained indistinct. No direct accusations, no formal inquiries, no definitive confrontation. Yet the sense of being observed returned intermittently. A glance held too long, a question asked too casually. In these tellings, perception becomes threat even without confirmation. The family responded predictably. Alignment tightened, communication narrowed. The same patterns repeated, now familiar. What had once been a strategy became instinct. Some believe this repetition marked the story's quiet transformation. The initial act, whatever it was, ceased to be the defining element. Instead, the sustained choice to avoid acknowledgement became central. The family's identity reshaped itself around maintenance rather than memory. There are versions where this shift created a paradox. The more effort invested in preserving silence, the more attention the silence demanded. It became impossible to ignore without actively reinforcing it. In these tellings, silence ceased to be absence and became presence. The moral weight of this presence is debated across reconstructions. Some interpret it as complicity, others as survival, others still as inevitability. No interpretation dominates. What remains consistent is the cost. Emotional fatigue accumulates, patience shortens, trust thins. The family continues to function, but not to rest. Stability becomes something that must be upheld rather than inhabited. There are accounts where one member begins to experience dissonance, not sudden clarity, just discomfort. The realization that the story they lived inside no longer aligned with the one they presented. This dissonance is never voiced, but it influences behavior subtly. Decisions are delayed, commitments feel heavier, the future becomes harder to imagine clearly. Some believe this is where the idea of exposure changes meaning. It no longer refers to public revelation, but internal rupture. The risk shifts from being discovered to being unable to continue pretending. This internal threat, unlike the external one, cannot be negotiated away. There are tellings where someone contemplates speaking, not to the world, but to another family member, a private acknowledgement, a shared burden. These moments are fleeting, fragile, and ultimately abandoned. The cost of breaking alignment feels too high. The family remains intact, but altered. According to every version that persists, this alteration is irreversible, not because of what happened, but because of how it was managed. Silence, once chosen as protection, became architecture, and architecture shapes behavior long after its purpose is forgotten. The family's world continued. But beneath its surface, something essential had shifted, not violently, not visibly, just enough to ensure that what followed would not arrive as shock, but as slow, unavoidable consequence. A consequence born not of exposure, but of endurance. There are versions that suggest the first visible crack appeared in something trivial, not an argument, not a confession, a forgotten detail. According to some tellings, it was a minor inconsistency, an assumption repeated one too many times, a sequence recalled differently by two people who had always agreed before. The discrepancy was small enough to dismiss, yet heavy enough to linger. Silence has a way of magnifying such moments. When nothing is said, attention sharpens. People notice what they would otherwise ignore. In these versions, the family's long discipline of restraint began to work against them. Every deviation stood out more clearly against the background of control. Some believe this was the moment the family stopped feeling unified and started feeling synchronized. There is a difference. Unity allows variation. Synchronization demands alignment. The latter is more fragile. There are accounts where one member became acutely aware of this fragility. They noticed how agreement no longer felt organic, how decisions were reached not through discussion, but through anticipation. Each person learned to predict what could be said safely and what could not. This anticipation, according to several interpretations, became exhausting. It required constant self-monitoring, tone, timing, phrasing, all adjusted to maintain equilibrium. The family continued to function, but the effort behind that functioning grew increasingly visible. Some believe this effort created resentment, not overt anger, but a quiet accumulation of fatigue, the sense that maintaining silence required disproportionate sacrifice, that the cost of cohesion was no longer shared evenly. Others insist no resentment formed, that the family's loyalty remained intact, that the strain was acknowledged internally and accepted as necessary. These accounts often emphasize discipline over emotion. Both interpretations coexist. What remains consistent is the shift in atmosphere. The home, once described as orderly, became tense in a way that resisted description, not hostile, not cold, just alert, as if everyone were listening for something they hoped would never arrive. There are versions where the memory of the woman returned more distinctly during this period. Not her face, not her voice, her role. The function she served within the narrative began to expand. She was no longer just the source of the threat, but the point at which the family's internal contradictions became visible. In these tellings, her absence felt less neutral. Some believe this shift led to moral dissonance. The family had justified their actions as protective, but protection implies preservation. Over time, it became harder to identify what had actually been preserved. Reputation remained intact. Structure remained standing, but something else felt diminished. There are accounts where one member began to experience this dissonance physically. Sleep became irregular. Appetite changed, concentration faltered. These symptoms are described cautiously, as possibilities rather than diagnoses. The story avoids certainty even here. Others interpret these changes as unrelated. Stress accumulates for many reasons. The human mind seeks patterns where none exist. These tellings emphasize coincidence over causation. Again, no consensus emerges. The family's interactions grew more formal, casual conversations thinned, spontaneity decreased, humor, when present, felt measured. The ease that once defined their dynamic became something they remembered rather than experienced. Some believe this formality functioned as armor. The more rigid the structure, the less vulnerable it felt. But rigidity also reduces flexibility. When pressure increases, something must give. There are versions where the first overt disagreement occurred around something unrelated. A decision about timing, a choice about obligation. The topic itself varied across tellings, but the reaction was similar. The disagreement escalated faster than expected, surprising everyone involved. The intensity felt disproportionate. This moment is often cited as significant, not because of what was argued, but because of how quickly restraint faltered. The argument revealed how much pressure had been contained beneath the surface. Some accounts suggest the disagreement ended abruptly, not resolved, terminated. Silence reasserted itself, heavier than before. The family returned to routine, but the rupture lingered unaddressed. Others describe a quieter outcome, a withdrawal rather than confrontation. One member disengaged emotionally, leaving the others to recalibrate around the absence. In these tellings, conflict is avoided at the cost of connection. The family did not revisit the disagreement. Revisiting would have required examination. Examination would have risked uncovering deeper fractures. Avoidance remained the preferred strategy. There are versions where external perception began to shift subtly, not suspicion, not accusation, distance. Friends or acquaintances sensed a change without identifying its source. Invitations became less frequent, conversations more superficial. These shifts are described tentatively, as impressions rather than events. Some believe this external distance reinforced internal isolation. The family's world narrowed. The circle of trust shrank. With fewer external anchors, the internal dynamics carried more weight. There are tellings where one member considered leaving, not permanently, not dramatically, just distance, space, time away from the structure that had become so tightly wound. These thoughts are always described as fleeting, never acted upon. The cost of departure felt too high. Leaving would disrupt alignment. It would draw attention. It would require explanation. The risks outweighed the relief. And so the family remained together, not because they were at peace, but because separation felt more dangerous than endurance. According to every reconstruction that persists, this period marks a subtle turning point. The family no longer believed silence alone would protect them. They believed silence must be maintained. This distinction matters. Protection implies response. Maintenance implies obligation. From this point forward, the story suggests the family's actions were guided less by fear of exposure and more by fear of collapse. The structure they had built around silence had become load-bearing, and any attempt to adjust it, however small, risked revealing how fragile it truly was. There are versions that suggest the family began to confuse stability with stillness, not because nothing was happening, but because nothing was allowed to move. According to some tellings, this confusion became the quiet engine driving everything that followed. The household appeared calm, but only because motion had been restrained. Emotion, curiosity, and disagreement were not resolved. They were suspended. Suspension, however, has weight. Over time, it presses downward. There are accounts where one family member began to notice how often conversations ended prematurely, not naturally, interrupted by a shared instinct to stop before something difficult emerged. In these moments, silence no longer felt protective. It felt directive. Some believe this was when fear changed shape. Earlier, fear had been external. Exposure, consequence, collapse. Now fear turned inward. The fear of speaking incorrectly, of remembering too clearly, of triggering a chain reaction no one could predict. This internal fear proved harder to manage. There were no boundaries for it, no clear conditions under which it would subside. It simply existed, shaping behavior through anticipation rather than reaction. The family's coordination grew tighter, not through instruction, but through pattern recognition. Each person learned how far they could go in conversation without crossing an invisible line. Over time, these lines multiplied. What was once a narrow boundary became a network of restrictions. Some tellings describe this network as suffocating. Others describe it as efficient. The difference often reflects who is speaking. There are versions where one member began to test the limits, not openly, not provocatively, through small deviations, a question framed differently, a memory referenced obliquely, a comment allowed to linger just a moment longer than usual. These actions were subtle enough to pass unnoticed, or so it was hoped. In some reconstructions, the response was immediate, a change in posture, a pause that stretched too long, a glance exchanged without explanation. The message was clear without being spoken, not here. These moments reinforced the boundaries more effectively than confrontation ever could. The family learned not only where the limits were, but how quickly they would be defended. Some believe this reinforcement accelerated internal fracture. When correction replaces communication, resentment grows silently. The effort required to maintain alignment increases. What once felt cooperative begins to feel imposed. Others argue the opposite, that these corrections preserved order, that without them, the structure would have collapsed. In these tellings, restraint is framed as discipline rather than suppression. Again, the story refuses to choose. What becomes undeniable is the shift in how the family experienced time. Moments stretched. Gatherings felt longer than before. The future became harder to visualize beyond immediate obligations. Planning narrowed, spontaneity vanished. There are accounts where this temporal compression produced anxiety. Without a sense of forward movement, the present became heavy. Each day carried the weight of what could not be addressed. In these versions, time felt less like progression and more like repetition. The woman's absence continued to exert pressure, though rarely acknowledged directly. She existed now as a reference point without form, a reminder that something had been removed from the narrative without resolution. Her role in the story shifted from catalyst to ghost, not haunting, but persistent. Some believe this persistence is what ultimately destabilized the family. Not guilt, not fear, incompletion, the sense that something essential had been interrupted mid-meaning, that a narrative had been cut short before it could reach coherence. Humans, according to these tellings, struggle more with unfinished stories than with painful ones. There are versions where one member began to imagine alternative histories, not fantasies, possibilities. What if a different response had been chosen? What if silence had not been the first instinct? These thoughts were always private, always hypothetical, but they mattered. They introduced contrast, and contrast reveals structure. By imagining alternatives, this family member became aware of how narrow their lived reality had become, how constrained their choices were by decisions no longer openly examined. Some believe this awareness marked the point of no return. Once alternatives are imagined, endurance becomes more difficult. The idea that things could have been different destabilizes the justification for how they are. There are tellings where this awareness spread subtly, not through discussion, but through behavior. Hesitation increased, agreement slowed, the efficiency of alignment declined, small delays accumulated. Others insist the awareness remained isolated, that the family's collective discipline absorbed the disturbance without visible consequence. These tellings often emphasize resilience over fragility. The truth, as always, remains unresolved. What is consistent is the presence of strain. The family's silence, once chosen, now required maintenance. Maintenance required energy. Energy depleted patience. Patience depleted goodwill. There are accounts where exhaustion became visible, not collapse, fatigue, emotional dullness, reduced tolerance. These symptoms appear repeatedly across versions, though never attributed to a single cause. The family did not seek relief. Relief would have required acknowledgement. Acknowledgement risked unraveling the structure they had invested so much in preserving. Endurance remained the default strategy. But endurance has limits. And according to every reconstruction that persists, the family approached those limits not through dramatic failure, but through gradual erosion. Trust weakened, connection thinned, silence deepened. By this point in the story, the threat of exposure had transformed entirely. What the family feared most was no longer discovery. It was disruption. The possibility that one small shift, a word, a memory, a moment of honesty could collapse the carefully balanced system they now lived inside. And in that fear, the narrative suggests, they became more vulnerable than they had ever been. Not to the outside world, but to themselves. There are versions that suggest the family did not notice the transition when endurance became habit. It didn't announce itself. It didn't demand acknowledgement. It simply settled in. According to some tellings, this is when the family stopped asking whether silence was still necessary and began assuming it was permanent. What began as a response to threat hardened into routine. Silence no longer protected something fragile. It defined it. The household adjusted accordingly. Expectations narrowed. Conversations became efficient. Emotional expressions softened to the point of neutrality. The family learned how to exist without friction, but also without relief. Some believe this phase felt deceptively stable. When tension becomes familiar, it stops registering as tension. It becomes background. In these versions, the family mistook adaptation for resolution. The absence of crisis was interpreted as success. Others insist the cost was always apparent. They describe a subtle grief that hovered beneath interactions, not for the woman specifically, but for something lost in the process: ease, trust, openness. These feelings were rarely articulated. They were sensed. There are accounts where one family member began to behave differently in small, difficult-to-measure ways. Pauses grew longer, responses less immediate, eye contact avoided at moments that once felt safe. These changes were never confronted. Confrontation would have required naming what everyone worked to avoid. The silence had matured. It no longer needed reinforcement. It was self-sustaining. Some tellings describe this silence as heavy but orderly, a structure that imposed predictability. Predictability reduces risk. Risk had become the family's primary concern, not from the outside, but from within. There are versions where memory itself began to change, not erased, edited, details blurred selectively. Certain sequences felt less accessible than others. This was not framed as deception, but as adaptation. The mind protects what the environment demands it protect. Some believe this selective memory marked a turning point, when the family's internal narrative began to drift from shared reality. Each person retained fragments, but the overlap diminished. Alignment continued, but understanding diverged. This divergence introduced quiet instability. People agreed without knowing exactly what they agreed about. They participated in routines without recalling their origin. The structure remained intact, but its foundation thinned. There are tellings where one member began to sense this thinning. A subtle recognition that the silence they lived inside no longer corresponded to a unified memory. That what bound them together was not shared understanding, but shared avoidance. This realization was not voiced. It lingered, untested. Some believe this untested awareness intensified internal conflict. When doubt cannot be examined, it becomes corrosive. It questions from the inside without offering resolution. In these versions, the family's stability depended increasingly on suppressing not only speech but thought. Others argue the family's discipline prevented such corrosion. That shared restraint preserved cohesion even as memory diverged. These tellings emphasize survival over coherence. Once again, the story resists choosing. What becomes clear is the family's relationship to time had shifted further. The past was inaccessible, the future uncertain, the present expanded to fill the space between. Days felt longer, events felt repetitive. Planning focused on immediate logistics rather than long-term vision. The family lived inside maintenance. There are accounts where external pressures faded almost entirely during this phase. No questions, no curiosity, no reminders. From the outside, the story seemed dormant. This absence of pressure reinforced the belief that silence had succeeded, that endurance had paid off. But dormancy is not resolution. According to some reconstructions, this is when the story's momentum turned inward completely. With no external threat to react to, the family's internal dynamics carried the full weight of what had been deferred. Small tensions intensified. A missed call felt significant. A delayed response felt intentional. A change in tone felt loaded. None of these moments were addressed directly. They accumulated. Some believe this accumulation created a paradox. The more the family avoided disruption, the more fragile disruption became. The system required constant equilibrium, leaving no margin for error. Stability, once flexible, became brittle. There are tellings where one member finally approached a breaking point. Not an outburst, not a confession, a withdrawal. Emotional distance increased. Participation declined. The presence remained, but the investment waned. In these versions, disengagement becomes the only available form of self-preservation. Others noticed, but did not intervene. Intervention would have required naming what was happening. Naming would have violated the central agreement. Silence was still the rule. The family continued, together, aligned, contained, but increasingly hollow. According to every version that persists, this phase marks the story's quiet acceleration, not toward exposure, but toward consequence. The choice to avoid acknowledgement had not erased the past. It had displaced it, and displacement, unlike resolution, demands energy indefinitely. The family's structure, once built to protect, now required constant maintenance to avoid collapse. And the cost of that maintenance, emotional, relational, psychological, continued to rise, unnoticed, unaddressed, and eventually unavoidable. There are versions that suggest the family reached a point where silence no longer felt like a choice. It felt like inheritance. According to some tellings, this is when the rules governing interaction stopped being remembered and started being assumed. No one recalled deciding not to speak. No one remembered agreeing to avoid certain subjects. The boundaries existed without origin, enforced by habit rather than intention. In these versions, silence achieved its most efficient form. It required no vigilance, no reminders, no correction. It simply operated. The family moved through shared spaces with practiced ease. Meals were prepared, conversations held, obligations fulfilled. On the surface, nothing appeared dysfunctional, yet beneath that surface, something essential had thinned. Some believe this thinning manifested as emotional neutrality. Reactions softened, enthusiasm faded. Disappointment registered briefly, then disappeared. The range of feeling narrowed, not because it was forbidden, but because it felt unnecessary. Expression risked imbalance. Balance was the priority. There are accounts where this neutrality was mistaken for maturity. Outsiders, when they appear at all in these tellings, interpreted the family's composure as strength, calm under pressure, dignity without display. The family, hearing this reflected back to them, felt affirmed. But affirmation can reinforce what should be questioned. Some believe this external validation solidified the internal pattern. The family learned that restraint was not only safer, but admired. Silence became virtue. Containment became identity. There are versions where one member began to experience a quiet contradiction. They felt respected but unseen, supported but unknown. The family functioned, yet connection felt increasingly abstract. This contradiction produced discomfort that had no clear outlet. In these tellings, the discomfort did not demand expression. It lingered. There are accounts where the memory of the woman, still without form, returned as a point of contrast rather than guilt. Not who she was, but what her presence had disrupted. She had forced articulation. She had introduced instability. Her absence restored order, but at a cost. Some believe this contrast sparked an unspoken realization. That disruption, while dangerous, had also been clarifying. That silence preserved structure but obscured truth. This realization, however, remained internal, unshared, and unresolved. Others insist no such realization occurred, that the family accepted the cost as inevitable, that stability justified sacrifice. These tellings emphasize acceptance over conflict. As always, the story allows both. What becomes consistent across reconstructions is the emergence of emotional economy. Words were chosen for efficiency, interactions optimized for predictability. The family conserved energy by avoiding depth. Depth, after all, carried risk. There are versions where this economy extended to memory itself. Certain recollections were accessed less frequently. Others became simplified. The past was not erased, but streamlined. Complex moments lost nuance. What remained were functional summaries that supported continuity. This streamlining created a shared present, but not a shared past. Some believe this divergence weakened the family's foundation. When memory fragments diverge too far, alignment depends on routine alone. Routine sustains behavior, but not understanding. Over time, this distinction matters. There are tellings where one family member noticed how often conversations repeated themselves, the same observations, the same reassurances, the same conclusions. Nothing new entered the space. Novelty felt disruptive. The family existed in a loop designed to minimize uncertainty. This loop, according to some interpretations, became suffocating. Without novelty, growth stalled. Without growth, frustration accumulated. Without acknowledgement, frustration had nowhere to go. Others interpret the loop as stability. Repetition reduces unpredictability. Predictability reduces risk. In these tellings, the family's strategy remained sound, if emotionally austere. What shifts in this phase is not strategy, but endurance. The effort required to maintain emotional neutrality increased. Small deviations demanded correction. A misplaced comment required recalibration. A lingering question required deflection. The system worked, but it was no longer effortless. There are accounts where fatigue became visible, not collapse, not breakdown, weariness. Participation continued, but without investment. Engagement felt obligatory. The family functioned as a unit, but the sense of shared purpose thinned. Some believe this weariness was the beginning of consequence, not exposure, not punishment, consequence. The kind that emerges when decisions made for survival outlive their necessity, when strategies become constraints, when protection becomes limitation. There are tellings where the family began to experience moments of misalignment, brief, subtle, easily dismissed, a reaction that arrived too late, and agreement offered without conviction. These moments did not escalate, they accumulated. Others insist these moments were insignificant, that every family experiences fatigue, that nothing in this story exceeds ordinary strain. These interpretations frame the narrative as cautionary, but not exceptional. Again, the story does not choose. What remains clear is that silence, once adopted, shaped everything that followed. It influenced how emotions were processed, how memories were held, how relationships were maintained. The family did not unravel, they endured. But endurance, as the story suggests, is not neutral. It leaves traces, it reshapes priorities, it alters what feels possible. According to every reconstruction that persists, this phase represents the final stabilization before something shifts again. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but inevitably. The family had built a structure strong enough to hold silence indefinitely, but not flexible enough to absorb change without consequence. And change, the story implies, does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, through fatigue, through repetition, through the gradual realization that preservation has limits. The family continued, believing they had mastered containment, unaware that containment, once complete, leaves no space for relief, and that what follows such completeness is not exposure, but reckoning, not imposed from outside, but emerging slowly and inexorably from within. There are versions that suggest the reckoning did not arrive as an event. It arrived as awareness, not sudden, not overwhelming, a gradual recognition that the structure holding everything together had become the thing exerting the greatest pressure. According to some tellings, this awareness surfaced first in moments of solitude, not during conversation, not during conflict, but in quiet spaces where performance was no longer required. Late at night, early in the morning, in pauses where no one was watching. Some believe one family member reached this point before the others, not because they were more perceptive, but because endurance had worn them thinner. The strategies that once felt necessary now felt automatic, and what becomes automatic eventually invites scrutiny. There are accounts where this family member began to question the logic that had governed their choices, not the original act that remained distant, abstract, but the ongoing commitment to silence. The realization formed slowly. The danger they were guarding against no longer existed in the same way. Exposure had not come, collapse had not followed, yet the cost continued. This realization did not bring relief, it brought confusion. If the threat was gone, why did the tension remain? If the past was contained, why did the present feel constrained? These questions, in most versions, were not voiced. They circulated internally, untested, destabilizing in their quiet persistence. Some believe this internal questioning marked a decisive shift. When justification weakens, maintenance becomes harder. Actions once explained by necessity begin to feel arbitrary. The effort required to sustain them grows heavier. There are tellings where this shift affected behavior subtly. Participation became selective. Agreement slowed. The family member no longer anticipated boundaries as efficiently. Small pauses appeared where compliance once flowed automatically. Others noticed, not immediately, not clearly, but alignment felt less precise. Conversations required more adjustment. The system, once smooth, developed friction. There are versions where another family member sensed this friction and responded instinctively, not with confrontation, but with reinforcement. More reassurance, more emphasis on continuity, more reminders, indirect, unspoken, of what stability required. These efforts, however, carried a different tone than before. Earlier, reinforcement felt protective. Now, it felt corrective. This shift altered how it was received. The family member experiencing doubt began to feel constrained rather than supported. The silence they once helped maintain now felt imposed rather than shared. Some believe this perception intensified internal conflict. When restraint is no longer voluntary, it breeds resistance, even if that resistance never becomes visible. The effort required to remain aligned increases sharply. There are tellings where the family member considered speaking openly, not publicly, not dramatically, within the family, a private acknowledgement that the silence had outlived its purpose, that maintenance had become burden, that something needed to change, not to expose, but to release. These tellings always emphasize hesitation. The cost of speaking felt immeasurable. Breaking silence risked not only disruption, but reinterpretation. Once words are spoken, meaning shifts. Responsibility reassigns itself. Some believe this risk proved too great. Others suggest the consideration alone was enough to alter the family's dynamic. Once the possibility of articulation exists, silence loses its absoluteness. It becomes a choice again, one that must be actively renewed. There are versions where this renewal became uneven. Some members reinforced silence more strongly, others relaxed their vigilance. The system's cohesion weakened, not dramatically but perceptibly. Small inconsistencies appeared, a reaction that lingered too long, a question answered too honestly, a memory referenced with unexpected clarity. These moments were subtle, easily dismissed, but they accumulated. There are accounts where one family member misinterpreted this shift as danger. They believed alignment was slipping, that the structure was weakening. Their response was not anger, but urgency, an attempt to restore order before instability spread. This urgency intensified pressure. The silence, once efficient, became tense. Correction replaced cooperation. Alignment required effort from all sides. Some believe this escalation accelerated fatigue. The emotional economy the family relied upon began to collapse under its own weight. Efficiency gave way to exhaustion, predictability to rigidity. There are tellings where one family member withdrew completely at this stage, not physically, emotionally. They continued to fulfill obligations, but without investment. Their presence remained, but their engagement vanished. This withdrawal altered the family's balance more than any spoken conflict could have. Others noticed. Again, nothing was said. Silence absorbed the change, but not without strain. According to some reconstructions, this is when the family reached its most precarious equilibrium. Not because exposure was imminent, not because truth threatened to emerge, but because the silence required more energy than anyone could sustainably provide. The structure they had built to protect themselves had become self-consuming. There are versions where this realization spread quietly, not through conversation but through shared fatigue, the recognition that maintaining alignment felt harder than risking disruption, that endurance no longer guaranteed stability. This recognition did not produce action, it produced hesitation. The family paused, collectively, if unconsciously, at the edge of change, unsure whether to continue as they had or to risk reconfiguration. The story does not specify what decision was made. It emphasizes instead the moment itself, the moment when silence stops feeling inevitable and starts feeling heavy, when protection becomes pressure, when maintenance becomes burden, and when the cost of continuing begins to rival the cost of change. According to every version that persists, this moment did not resolve anything, but it marked the beginning of the end of endurance as strategy. What followed would not arrive as exposure, it would arrive as consequence, not imposed from outside, but emerging slowly and unavoidably from the structure the family had built and lived inside for far too long. There are versions that suggest the final shift did not arrive with confrontation. It arrived with exhaustion, not the kind that collapses the body, but the kind that erodes conviction, the kind that makes rules feel heavier than the reasons that once justified them. According to some tellings, this exhaustion spread quietly, unannounced, until it became the dominant condition inside the family. The silence was still intact, but it no longer felt protective. It felt maintained. Some believe this is when endurance lost its meaning. Endurance implies purpose, an understanding of what is being endured and why. Maintenance, by contrast, requires repetition without reflection. In these versions, the family crossed that threshold without noticing. They continued because stopping required energy they no longer had. There are accounts where routines began to falter slightly. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, a missed timing, a response delivered too late, an agreement offered without certainty. These deviations were small, but they mattered. The system relied on precision. When precision weakened, the strain became visible. Some family members responded by tightening control, more reminders, more structure, more emphasis on continuity. Others responded by letting go, not openly, internally. The effort to anticipate boundaries diminished. Compliance slowed. Silence became passive rather than intentional. These opposing responses created imbalance. The family was no longer synchronized. Alignment required negotiation. Negotiation required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement remained forbidden. There are tellings where this tension manifested as irritation, not anger, friction. The kind that arises when expectations go unmet without explanation, when behavior changes without permission, when the rules remain, but the commitment to them fades. Some believe this friction was the first honest signal, not of guilt, not of exposure, of cost, the cost of preserving something that no longer served its original purpose. There are versions where one family member reached a quiet conclusion, not that the silence had been wrong, but that it had expired. That the decision made under threat no longer fit a world where that threat had dissolved. This realization did not produce action, it produced mourning, a recognition that the past could not be revisited, but the present could still be reshaped. Others never reached this conclusion. They remained committed to endurance, to continuity, to the belief that stability justified its own cost. In these tellings, divergence becomes the central fracture, not what happened, but how its aftermath should be carried. The family did not discuss this divergence. Discussion would have forced clarity. Clarity would have redistributed responsibility. The silence persisted, now strained by disagreement that had no language. There are accounts where the memory of the woman returned one last time. Not as catalyst, not as threat, as measure. A point of comparison for how much had been surrendered in the name of preservation. These reflections were private, brief, and unresolved. They did not seek justice. They sought proportion. Some believe this reflection altered how the family perceived itself. The narrative they had maintained of protection, loyalty, necessity felt incomplete, not false, but insufficient. The cost had been higher than anticipated, the benefit less enduring. There are tellings where the family's interactions grew increasingly formal. Warmth was replaced by courtesy, familiarity by politeness. The home felt orderly but distant. The structure remained intact, but connection thinned. This distance, according to some reconstructions, was the story's final consequence. Not exposure, not punishment, estrangement, not separation of bodies, but of understanding. The family continued to exist together, but without the intimacy that once justified their unity. Others insist estrangement never fully took hold, that affection remained, that care persisted. These tellings emphasize continuity over loss. They suggest the family adapted once more, finding a new equilibrium within constraint. The story allows this possibility. It does not insist on collapse. What it insists on is consequence, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that accumulates through repetition, the kind that reshapes relationships quietly. There are versions where the family never speaks of the past again, not because it is resolved, but because it has been absorbed into structure. It no longer requires suppression. It exists as context rather than content. In these tellings, silence becomes ambient rather than enforced, and yet something remains altered. The ease that once defined the family never returns. Trust exists, but cautiously. Connection persists, but measured. The cost of preservation continues to shape interaction long after the threat has vanished. Some believe this outcome is inevitable, that decisions made under fear rarely dissolve cleanly. They leave residues, habits, assumptions, boundaries that persist beyond necessity. Others argue the family survived intact, that survival itself is meaning enough, that not all stories require redemption or clarity. That endurance, even imperfect, is preferable to fracture. The narrative does not choose between these interpretations, it holds them both. As the story reaches its final movement, what becomes clear is not who was right or wrong. It is what happens when silence is chosen as solution and then outlives the problem it was meant to solve. The family did not face exposure, they faced endurance, and endurance reshaped them in ways no single decision ever could. Not through one act, not through one moment, but through years of maintenance. According to every version that survives, this is where the story settles. Not with revelation, not with confession, but with the recognition that some consequences arrive not as events, but as conditions, quiet, persistent, and inseparable from the choices that created them. There are versions that suggest the story never truly resolved, only settled, not into peace, not into guilt, into condition. According to some tellings, the family did not collapse under the weight of what they carried. They adjusted, they endured, and in doing so, they transformed something momentary into something permanent. What began as a response became an identity. Silence was no longer chosen, it was inherited, not enforced, not questioned, simply lived. Over time, the absence of confrontation became as defining as any action ever taken. The family continued, intact in form, altered in substance. Some believe this is the quiet danger of decisions made under pressure, not the decision itself, but its afterlife. When fear passes, its structures often remain. They shape behavior long after their purpose has expired. They turn survival into routine and routine into constraint. The woman at the center of the story does not return here as a symbol of guilt or justice. She exists only as a measure of how far the family traveled to protect itself and what it surrendered along the way. No verdict is offered, no certainty claimed. This narrative does not ask you to judge. It asks you to notice, to recognize how easily silence can feel safer than truth, how loyalty can drift into complicity, how endurance, when prolonged, reshapes what feels normal. Some stories end with exposure, others end with forgiveness. This one ends with continuation, a family that remains, a structure that holds, a cost that lingers. And perhaps that is the most unsettling outcome of all. Not that something terrible happened, but that life went on,